Okay, so yes, welcome everybody. Today, we would be moving on to a new module, which is vulnerabilities, IOCs, and MITRE ATT&CK. So we'll start with the first topic of this module that talks a bit about vulnerabilities and what are the things that we expect to achieve by the end of this lesson. So we'll talk a bit about different types of threats. We'll talk about some malwares. How do those attacks work related to those malwares? We'll talk about indicators of compromise, one of the most common thing that, let's say, anybody who wishes to start a career in cybersecurity and wants to opt for, let's say, a security operations role, need to be very well versed with. So indicators of compromise is something that would be part of your day-to-day objective or your day-to-day job role. Okay. And indicators of compromise are followed by what we call as threat intelligence. So we'll talk about all of these terms. What do they mean? How do they work together? And we'll close the session by talking about pyramid of pain. Okay. So let's start by talking a bit about the vulnerabilities, what exactly vulnerabilities are, their different categories. So since the beginning, we have talked a lot about vulnerabilities being anything that could expose an attack surface, or let's say anything that is opening up a surface in your infrastructure that could be a potential attack. Okay. Now, one thing that I want you to understand before we move on with the categories is that every vulnerability might not translate into a threat. What I'm trying to say with that is, let's say, okay, you have two servers. One of the server, both have the same vulnerability. Now, one server is located in a network which has all the security controls, all the guards around it. That makes, let's say, impossible for an attacker to reach that server. Now, that server has a vulnerability, but it cannot be exploited. So in that case, that vulnerability does not translate into a threat. Whereas, let's say, okay, we have another server with the same vulnerability, but that server is on the internet. It is actually facing the internet. In that scenario, yes, we have a higher chance or a higher probability that the server would be attacked or that vulnerability would be exploited. So very important that you make sure you understand that whenever we talk about vulnerabilities, we do not always associate them with threats. Vulnerabilities could exist, but if they are very secured in the terms of the assets in which the vulnerabilities exist, they might not translate into a threat. Okay. The next thing we talk about is where are the different areas in an IT space where we can identify vulnerabilities. So if you see, we have a couple of different categories. Starting off with the first one, we talk about software vulnerabilities. So any vulnerabilities, let's say that would exist as part of any software in your infrastructure. So what are the different types of softwares we use? We have operating systems, let's say we have websites, we have applications. So anything that is a combination of lines of code, a database, or a software running together to perform a program, it is categorized under a software vulnerability. And a very good example that has been specified around software vulnerability is buffer overflow. How does it work? Let me give you a very quick example to help you understand this. So let's say you have a RAM. Okay, let's take this as a RAM. Now, a RAM has different sections in which every application is running. So you are running Microsoft Word, Excel, you have different applications open. So every application is consuming its own space, right? Its own processing capacity in your RAM. So let's say, okay, this is the capacity for app one, this is for app two, and then, okay, probably you have another app three. Now, what does buffer overflow signify? Let's say you have this application. Now, the attacker tries to misuse the application in a way that they are giving an input that is not something that the application can afford to process. So any input that comes beyond the capacity of the application lets the application take up some space from the adjacent application, due to which either you can corrupt the other application, or let's say you can capture information that is currently being processed by the other application. So that is what the buffer overflow vulnerabilities are about. Now, the vulnerability comes from the software. Why? Because it's the application that can accept certain kinds of input. So if you have not developed the application securely, if your application is not secure in terms of how it's developed, it would have a more susceptibility to these kind of vulnerabilities. Then you have network vulnerabilities. Any vulnerability that is outside of your software, so your networks, your the way you communicate with your devices, your solutions deployed, where your devices are located in the infrastructure, anything regarding that refers to as a network vulnerability. Now, a very good example regarding network vulnerability is herd bleed. Now, this was a bug that came in 2014. It doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, like you won't see a lot of this vulnerability, I would say, prominently in the world, because you may have seen a lot of times we talk about TLS 1.2, we talk about SSL 3.0. So this particular vulnerability was under OpenSSL, which was, let's say, a protocol used a decade ago. So 10 to 12 years ago. Now we do not have that protocol anymore. We often rely on TLS 1.2 and above to make a secure communication, but that's how OpenSSL was found to be vulnerable to a herd bleed bug, where similar way you could put a more input than what the software could process, the RAM could process as part of that application, and you get a lot of sensitive information in return. But in this case, you are not actually exploiting the software, you are exploiting the communication channel. OpenSSL is a way to communicate, to make sure that you are following a secure communication channel. So that's where it differs itself from a software vulnerability. Okay, there is a very good link if you guys want to explore. If you go ahead and let's say search for herd bleed. So you have a herdbleed.com. It's a complete web page dedicated to this herd bleed bug. It gives you what the bug was all about, what was the CVID. So if you look at the CVID, it is 2014. That's the year when this vulnerability actually came in. Okay, what was the design flaw? So if you want more details and you want to dig a bit deep into what this vulnerability actually was, you can definitely have a look at this page. It's really interesting. Okay, then you have vulnerabilities that could arise from the hardware. So let's say, okay, we talked about the softwares, we talked about the network. Then you also have vulnerabilities in the hardware. When I'm talking about hardware, we are talking about microprocessors, your CPUs, your chips. So they also have vulnerabilities. There are, you would be surprised to know that there are specialized devices you could put near a CPU that would listen to how the CPU is processing in terms of its speed and the noise it makes to understand what kind of data is being processed by the CPU cycle. So that's a hardware vulnerability. You don't want any sort of information being leaked by how your hardware is working, right? So any of those things come under hardware vulnerabilities. There is a good example about Spectre. Now, Spectre is also a vulnerability that was available as part of the microprocessor chips, in which how the microprocessor is, let's say, prioritizing tasks. Now, you have Zoom open, you have, let's say, Codio open in another page. So CPU is bouncing between Zoom and Codio and your Internet Explorer or Microsoft Edge or Chrome, back and forth. Sometimes you are operating Zoom, sometimes you are going to your Explorer. So the CPU has a predefined technique to, let's say, guess what needs to come next. This is something that the attacker started taking advantage of. So that vulnerability comes under what you call as Spectre. So you can do a quick Google and you would be able to capture a lot more information about what this vulnerability is, how it actually works. The last vulnerabilities, we spent a lot of time on that in the last session as well. Human related vulnerabilities. So anything related to social engineering, anything related to phishing attacks, weak passwords, all these are categorized under human related vulnerabilities. So all in all, if you see, these are the different components of an IT infrastructure. You have softwares, you have hardwares, you have network, and you have humans. So all of them could have different sorts of vulnerabilities. Now, to put it together, when you say that there is a big attack, a company got, let's say they fell into a big attack by a group of attackers, it's mostly a combination of these vulnerabilities. So let's say, okay, they sent out a phishing email, they compromised an account. So they first made use of a human related vulnerability. Okay. Now the account got compromised. From that compromised account, they identified a server that has a vulnerability. Now, this is a network based vulnerability. Why? Because from that machine, they are able to go to a server. The network is not secure anymore. Now, on the server, they found another vulnerability. On the OS, it's a Windows Server 2008, very old. It has a vulnerability. So now they found a software based vulnerability. Now, if they are able to exploit the CPU, they would also be able to take advantage of a hardware based vulnerability. So that's how all of these vulnerabilities actually work together, or let's say are dependent on each other to carry out a large scale attack. Does that make sense? Yes? How do different types of vulnerabilities work and what is the relation between each? Perfect. So next, we look at what are the different types of threats that originate from these vulnerabilities. So if we talk about some threats, the first one, like mentioned, is injection attack. Now, this is one of the most widely, let's say, used or widely available attack in which you are making use of any kind of input fields available on a website. So let's say, okay, if you see on the screen, you have an option where you can type something in the search content and it will help find exact information related to what we type, right? So anything on a website, on an application that is allowing you to input something can be an entry point for an injection attack. So we could input a script, we could input a code in that particular box, and that code would be interpreted at the backend to carry out the attack for us. Let's say bring out some confidential information, make sure that the server stops running, whatever we want to do with that. So anywhere you have an input field and that input field is not secured, it would be susceptible to injection attack. Then you also have buffer overflows, which we talked about. So to make sure whatever input is coming is actually sanitized and is actually validated, it needs to be checked, right? That the application should have a code, the software should have a code that would say that, okay, anything coming beyond this, I'm not going to accept. Okay. So we do have a question. Is it same as SQL injection? Yes. So SQL injection is actually a subcategory of injection attack. You have different types of injections you could do. You could do a command injection. You could do an LDAP injection. You could do a SQL injection. So anytime you do injection on a database, which is a SQL server, it is said as a SQL injection attack. Then you also have something known as a replay attack. Now, what does replay attack mean? We are just trying to capture a legitimate operation going on and we store it to replay it at another time. So let's say you call to a customer care, you are authenticating based on your voice. Once authenticated, you can carry out certain tasks, right? You can request for your account information, you can update your details. Now, let's say there is an attacker who just captures your voice to authenticate. Now they can reuse your voice to re-authenticate with the customer care and request other changes. Similarly, let's say, okay, you go to a banking site, you are entering your username and password. Okay, you enter your ID and password, you click on login. Now, there is an attacker who is capturing this information. Now, he can use this information again as part of a replay attack and send it on to the banking server to re authenticate you as an individual. So, that's how replay attacks work. Okay. Next, you have is privilege escalation. Privilege escalation refers to when you have compromised something and you want to run something with the higher privileges. So let's say, okay, I sent out a phishing email, an account got compromised. Now that account belongs to a standard person or individual from the sales team. who cannot do a lot on the servers because they don't have access onto the servers. Now, my objective is I'm from their account, I'm able to compromise an account of a sysadmin that would allow me to run commands on the server, that would allow me to disrupt the server, open up new connections, and do all sorts of activities I want to do as part of my attack. So I'm trying to escalate my privileges to carry out a bigger attack in terms of impact rather than what I was able to achieve by compromising a regular sales account. And when you look at it from a case study perspective, if you look at the case studies around attacks, they always start with the low hanging fruits. So our objective is to first find accounts that are easy to get in. And those accounts are not very privileged accounts. They are very basic standard accounts. And then our objective changes into from that basic account, get to an account that would, let's say, help us carry out some extra activities on the server level or on a privilege level that will actually make a big impact of the attack we are trying to execute. Okay. Then you also have a forgery attack where you are actually creating fake communication, you are creating fake data, you are trying to, let's say, create phishing emails or impersonating emails. You are trying to impersonate the email as a CEO of the company, and you are trying to send that email that, okay, you need to, let's say, transact this much amount of money by the evening. It's coming from the CEO. So you are forging your identity as a CEO. So anytime you are trying to, let's say, play fake, that is what is known as a forgery attack. So we had a question about LDAP injection. So I'll quickly give an understanding or a background on LDAP injection. How does LDAP injection works? So LDAP actually refers to lightweight directory access protocol. That's the full definition of LDAP. Okay. Now, what this lightweight directory access protocol does, every time you have an account, right? You have a correlation one account, you may have your own account, you may have an account from your company. You need to authenticate. Where does that authentication go? Where is your username and password actually going to authenticate you that, okay, you are the right ID, you have given the right password, and you are allowed to access the infrastructure? All of that authentication goes via LDAP. LDAP is actually the query. It is the query sent by a user to authenticate them. And this query is sent to something known as a DC, which stands for domain controller. Okay. Every company has a lot of domain controllers. This is a server that is actually holding all the user accounts and their passwords. So every time you want to authenticate, it takes your request from the user, it takes it to the domain controller. Now, how that request goes, it goes in the form of LDAP. LDAP is, let's say, the structure, how the request needs to be transmitted between the user and the domain controller. That's what LDAP is used for. So anytime you are able to, as an attacker, you are able to inject an LDAP command onto the domain controller to get details of all the usernames and passwords in that, let's say, directory, you are doing an LDAP injection attack. Okay, so that's how LDAP injection work. It is a very severe attack. It's a very dangerous attack. Why? Because if somebody is able to successfully do an LDAP injection attack, they get visibility into all the accounts that exist in the company, which is a big risk. Now they can try to compromise those accounts, capture their passwords, and try to break in into individual accounts, right? So that's how risky LDAP injection is. I hope that addressed the question. So going back, we have another type of threat known as directory traversal attack. Now, what is a directory traversal attack? Whenever you go to a website, you go to a page, you access some stuff, you are logging in, and then you are given a home page, you have an about us page, you have a contact us page, different things you see, right? Now, let's say there are a lot of other pages hosted on the website or on the web server that are not visible to you, that are not allowed to be visible to anyone who is trying to access them, but they're doing some other task or they are used in the background. A directory traversal attack actually takes advantage of a command where you can actually visit those pages that are actually not something that needs to be available on the internet. Every website has hundreds of, let's say, pages, hundreds of different links that work together to show you the site, what you see on your screen. And you can only do certain things on the site. You're not allowed to play with the site at let's say 100% of what is available on the server. So anytime you are trying to do an attack where you can access web pages that are hosted on the server behind that site is known as a directory traversal attack. So let me show you something over here that would probably make it a bit more clear. Let's say, okay, you access a website. Now you go to abc.com. Okay, that's the site you go. Now under abc.com, you have a about us page you can access. You have a contact us page you can access. You probably has a link to, let's say, submit your comments. So there are a couple of things you could do in that page. Now, let's say there is another page known as managing, which is used to manage the page, manage the content on that page, which is not accessible to you. Okay. But you can do a directory traversal attack and play with the path that would allow you to actually access this page, which you are not authorized to, or which should ideally not be accessible in an ethical way. Okay. So that is what is known as a directory traversal attack. So yes, do privilege escalations can be caused by manipulating URLs of an application? At some point, yes, but like when you are trying to manipulate the URLs, you are trying to play with the application in terms of retrieving the content. So you're not actually, I would say, doing a privilege escalation at a whole level, because privilege escalation involves, okay, you completely take over that site and you're trying to inject your own code. So it can be done, but it's not something we would ideally say that, okay, you are playing with the URL, it leads to privilege escalation. It can, but it's not always the case. Okay. And yes, when we talk about directory traversal, website mapping is a thing we actually do when we are trying to conduct a directory traversal attack. We need to create a map. What all links exist? What are the different pages that exist? What are the things we can play with? And then we identify one vulnerability that could allow us to inject our command, and we could gain access to the web pages or the sites that are not visible to us. So that is something known as a directory traversal attack. Any unauthorized directories or files that can be accessed via your, let's say, regular website scanning is known as a directory traversal attack. So we have a quick knowledge check question over here. So this question states a woman receives a call. What appears to be a daughter's phone number. The caller, pretending to be her daughter, claims to be in trouble and requests a ransom from the mother. The caller had spoofed a daughter's phone number, make it seem like a legitimate call for help. So then the mother considers paying the ransom until she realizes it's a scam. So what kind of threat from the above you think this one is? Feel free to put down your guesses on the link on the chat. Okay, so we do have a quiz thread, so you can make use of that. So we do see a couple of on replays. So yes, that's right. It's a replay attack because you are capturing the communication between the mother and the daughter and trying to replay it for a ransom. We talked about something known as deep fakes in the last class, if you guys remember. Nowadays, deep fakes are really used to do these scams. They are trying to create videos, audios, and then sending out to grandparents and asking them for money that, okay, the grandson is broke or they are in a situation they need a money to actually get out of it. And people are falling for it because the voice is real, the image is real, the video is real. So that makes it really authentic. So something definitely looking forward to. The next we look at is what are the different types of malwares that we actually categorize in an IT security world. Okay, what are the different types of attacks that exist or the malwares that exist? The first one is a ransomware attack. Ransomware is something that has a characteristic. So all the malwares, be it a virus, be it a Trojan, they have characteristics that, okay, they want to disrupt your systems. They want to play with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your infrastructure. How they play, what do they do to actually, let's say, violate your confidentiality or your integrity or your availability defines that, okay, it's a ransomware, it's a virus, or it's a worm. Okay. So starting off with the ransomware, ransomware has a characteristics where it is actually encrypting your file. So let's say, okay, you have different types of file. Whenever you have a PDF file, it is opened in Adobe Acrobat, right? You use a PDF to open in Adobe or Microsoft Edge. Then you have a dot word that is opened in Microsoft Word. So every file has an extension which is used by the associated program to open that file. In a ransomware attack, what they do is they try to encrypt all the files with an extension that no program can understand. So what happens eventually? None of the application is allowed, or let's say is available to open those files, and the files are not available at all. You cannot use those files. You cannot access those files. So the attackers say that, okay, you pay us some money, and in return, we will decrypt your files, or we'll give you the key to decrypt your files. So we'll give you the, let's say, the key to remove the lock of that decryption. Majority of the companies, what we see in today's world, are scared of this attack. They are not really much scared about viruses. They're not really much scared about Trojans, but what they are scared about is a ransomware attack. Why? Because first, it leads to data breach. Their data can be, let's say, taken up by attackers, and the attackers could misuse it. They could leak it on the internet. And at the same time, if their data is not available, their business is going down. So they have a lot of business loss as well. So that's why the impact of ransomware attacks are really high. WannaCry was one of the major ransomware attacks that happened in 2017 because of a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows. Very good case study to look forward for. I think more than 50% of the Microsoft Windows machines all over the world were compromised because of this ransomware attack. The next one, what we have is a Trojan attack or a Trojan malware. Trojan is something that comes off from, let's say, you download a lot of software programs which are free. You download freewares, you download free programs from different sites like SourceForge. It gives you free games to access. Anything that seems like it's a free game but is coming along with a malware at the back end is known as a Trojan. Okay, so it looks genuine, it looks clean, you get a free service along with it, but when you install it, along with the free service, you get a program that runs in your machine and installs a malware at the background. That is known as a Trojan malware. Then you have something known as a worm. Now, worm is also a category of malware, but the biggest difference it has from, let's say, Trojan and viruses is that the worm auto replicates. It doesn't require an application, it doesn't require a file, it just automatically replicates itself. Okay. So let's say I create a worm and I put it in a workstation. It will automatically move on to other workstations like a plague. It will automatically find different servers, different workstations. It doesn't require any human intervention. It automatically runs its course and it will infect the whole infrastructure. That is the biggest characteristics of worm, that it doesn't require any file. Trojan requires a file, right? It requires a file that looks good. So you need to execute the file to actually make the Trojan work. But in the case of a worm, it works automatically on its own. It doesn't require any support from anyone. Okay. Then you have something known as a spyware. spywares are installed in your browsers. Many of times, how many of you have actually seen that, okay, you install a browser, you have a Google as your homepage, and your homepage changes to Yahoo or Hotmail after some time. And then you go back, changing the homepage back to Google. A lot of time these things happen because you download certain softwares, you download certain applications that are bringing in spywares with them. And those spywares are actually used to, let's say, capture all the information what you are doing on the internet. So they are spying on you. They are checking what you are typing on your keyboard. They are checking what kind of sites you are visiting. Now, this is used for marketing as well. They pick your information and they sell it to other third parties that, okay, this guy searches for, uh, some kind of electronic equipment, or let's say this guy is a crazy fan of PlayStation, so he's always looking around for PlayStations. Then you start to get seeing a lot of deals around PlayStations, a lot of advertisements, because there are spywares working in the background of your browser. Okay. Then you have something known as a bloatware. It is more of a, let's say, a deviation from spyware, but any unwanted applications. You buy a new iPhone, you get a lot of Apple applications pre-installed that are not of your use, like, right? But they are capturing some space in your machine, they are capturing some RAM, and they are available. Sometimes you can delete them, sometimes you cannot. So any pre-installed applications that are coming with the native softwares are known as bloatwares. Then you have a virus. So virus is actually something that runs on its own. It does work as a worm when it runs on its own, but it requires a file to run. That's where the difference between a worm and a virus comes into. Let's try to quickly understand the difference. So when you have a Trojan is when you have a file. So let's say I'm downloading a game, and when I install that game, a Trojan gets installed along with it. So that is a factor where I can say, okay, it's a Trojan that came along with the game. Okay, that's a one type of malware. Then you have something known as a virus. Okay, I downloaded the game. Now that game got installed and it ran a virus. Now that virus will automatically find for other programs, other games where it could associate itself and spread. Because the main characteristic of virus is that it spreads automatically. Trojan, once executed, it's done. It's not doing anything else. But virus, once executed, it will find other machines. Now the virus will say, okay, I have infected this one. I need to find another machine where I can associate myself with the game over there. And as soon as the guy will click on the game, I will execute myself. That's how the virus will work. Okay, so it will start finding other machines. When we talk about a worm, now a worm doesn't need a game to run. It runs automatically. I put it on a PC. The worm will automatically infect the PC, find another PC, from there find another, and another. So it will automatically replicate without the requirement of an application. The worm doesn't require an application at all. Okay, but the virus does require an application, but it also automatically replicates to other application. A Trojan requires an application, but doesn't replicate at all. Does this help understand the difference between Trojan, virus, worm? Yes? Are you guys following with me? Okay. Then you have something known as a keylogger. What exactly a keylogger is? A keylogger could be a software, it could be a hardware device as well, that could be as small as a USB you have for a mouse, right? You have a very small USB which you could use it to attach a mouse with your machine. A keylogger is actually recording all the keystrokes you are doing on your keyboard. Whatever you are typing, it actually captures your keystrokes. That would now, let's say, include your usernames, your passwords if you are logging into a website, everything what you do with your keyboard. gets logged into a text file like what you see on the screen. So this is a text file that is logging everything the user is doing on the keyboard. So that's what a keylogger is actually doing. Then you have something known as a logic bomb. Logic bomb is a malware where it stays in the machine as long as the condition doesn't, uh, as long as the condition is not reached for it to trigger. So let's say I install a logic bomb on a machine, and I say that anytime the user actually opens a banking site, you need to execute. If the user is not opening the banking site, you just stay as it is. The malware will not execute itself. It will just stay in a sleeping mode and will only execute when the user actually logs into the banking site, because that is something what I'm looking out to capture. So that's how the workflow, what you see on the screen. So it checks the input. If the input is that the condition is reached, it will activate the code. If the condition is not reached, it will stay dormant. It won't do anything. Okay, so that is what a logic bomb is. The last we have is something known as a rootkit. Now, rootkit is also one of the most dangerous forms of malware because rootkit is something that attaches itself in the OS. Now, let me give you another example to understand that. Your operating system, you talk about Linux, you talk about Windows, you talk about Mac, all work the same way. There is one layer that has all your applications, whatever you install, whatever you do on the internet, it is running at a layer which is known as a ring, called as ring 0. Okay. So this is a layer in which, let's say, every of your application is running what you do on the internet. So you get a virus, you get a Trojan, everything is under this layer. Now, after this, you have a layer of your OS, which is your Windows, Linux, or Mac, which is the actual operating system running below your applications. So anytime you have a virus, it is not on the OS, it's on the file layer. So you can remove it. You can use an antivirus and remove the virus. You use an antivirus, remove the worm. But if, let's say, there is a malware that goes into the OS, you cannot remove it at all. Why? Because once it reaches the OS, it works as part of the OS. So the antivirus does not have the capability to go inside the OS and see what's going on. For the antivirus, the OS is always secure. It needs to be trusted. But in this case, the rootkit actually goes and stays in the OS, making it really hard to detect and delete. And that is why whenever we see that a machine got infected with a rootkit, we actually completely destruct the machine and re-image it. We install a fresh Windows, we install a fresh Linux instance. We cannot delete it. So anytime you see, okay, a rootkit got installed, you need to completely remove the Windows or the Mac or the Linux distribution and reinstall it as a fresh install to make sure you leave no traces of the rootkit that actually existed as part of the attack. Okay, so going back, we have covered Trojans, we covered ransomwares, we covered viruses, we covered worms, we covered bloatware, keyloggers, logic bombs, and then rootkits. Does the difference make sense? Do you understand like how the characteristics differ for each of the malwares? Feel free to put your questions on the chat. With that, let's move on to the next part that talks about now physical attacks. So we talked about malwares, we talked about a bit of network vulnerabilities. Now we'll see what kind of physical attacks actually exist. Okay, so there are a couple of physical attacks like RFID cloning. What is RFID cloning? You have a badge, right? You have a badge that gives you access to your infrastructure. You swipe your card, you get access to your premises. You swipe your card, you get access to your building. Now, you have devices that could be used to clone that information from the access card, and then you can use another card with the same rights to access the building or the premise, which is known as RFID cloning. So you are cloning all the information that exists under your swipe card to another card, which could be used to access the premises. Then you have environmental attacks that are okay. Let's say the servers always need to operate in a very cool environment. You cannot operate servers, you cannot have server rooms that do not have good heating ventilation. They need to have good air conditioning to keep the servers cool. Now, let's say somebody tried to manipulate the AC controls or the temperature and they increase the temperature to maximum heat. What will happen? The servers will stop, they will crash, they won't be able to support the processing anymore. So it is an attack, it's an environmental attack. We are not actually taking advantage of a vulnerability, but we are making the conditions difficult for a server to survive. Okay. Then you have USB drives. When you can use USB drives, you can infect USB drives and then plug into different parts of the infrastructure to cause different attacks. The biggest example of infection through USB device is Stuxnet. How many of you have heard about Stuxnet? Give me a thumbs up if you heard about this attack. No? Okay, some of you had. For those who haven't, Stuxnet was a program where Iran's complete nuclear development was destroyed by US intelligence agencies with the help of an infected USB drive. So there is a very good documentary available on Netflix. You can watch around Stuxnet that gives an understanding how a small USB drive could actually disrupt the whole facility that is processing nuclear power program for a country. So how big the impact could be from just let's say infected USB drives, that's a very good example to understand that. Okay. The last one, what you have is eavesdropping. So let's say, okay, you are just standing close to someone who is talking to the customer care, giving his account details, giving his PIN. You try to intercept what information is going on, and then you try to impersonate them. So you're trying to eavesdrop. If somebody's sitting beside me trying to log in, I'm trying to just, keep an eye and see what they are doing. That is what we call under eavesdropping. Okay. So this is a very good video. You could definitely take a look. That gives you an understanding that how somebody pretending to be, someone who has a lot of stuff on his hand asks people to give access to different parts of a network or an infrastructure, and then he gets to a conference room. So, and this actually happens in real life as well. You would have people who are attackers, they try to pretend something and they get access to, let's say, a conference room that is located way inside the company, and you have really confidential, let's say, documents in that conference room which the attackers can gain access to. So a very good fun video to look onto to understand how without technical knowledge. Now, these things do not require you to have a lot of technical knowledge or expertise. This is something that how smart you are, you could actually conduct a good social engineering attack. So we have a couple of questions. Can biometric information be cloned? Yes, biometric information can be cloned. It could be used, but you need to have sophisticated technology to clone it. It's not I could clone it by myself. I need to have sophisticated scanners that could clone it, and then I could reuse that technology to impersonate as someone. Okay, how bad is rootkit to infect a system and by what means it affects? So rootkit is the worst thing in terms of infection a system could afford. If it is infected by a rootkit, it is as good as destruction. It needs to be completely re-imaged. Even good companies, let's say the federal agencies or Department of Defense, if they find a rootkit, they don't even use the hardware anymore. They don't reuse the hardware. They destroy the hardware and order a fresh set of hardware along with the software to build up a new machine. That's how critical they treat security in their terms. Okay, so it could go as bad, but the biggest problem is the rootkit actually works on the layer in which your operating system actually resides. not on the layer where you install applications, not on the layer where you run antivirus. It works on the layer where you have your OS running at the baseline. So that's why it can cause a big impact. Okay, does that sound good? Following up on the content? Yes, things are making sense. Pieces are adding up. Perfect. So let's move on to network attacks and see what different types of network attacks exist. Now, the first one is distributed denial of service. What is distributed denial of service? Now, there are two aspects, okay? One, you have a denial of service attack where let's say, okay, I have one machine and I have one server over here. I want to conduct a denial of service attack. This is a server. I need to do a denial of service attack, and this is an attacker who wants to do it. Now, let's say this server can process 10 requests in 1 second. Now, if I need to do a denial of service attack, what I'll do is I'll make sure I use a tool to send 20 requests per second. The server will not be able to process all of them together and the server will crash. I have conducted my denial of service attack. How do I do a distributed denial of service attack? Instead of using one machine, I use hundreds and thousands of other machines. And then I instruct all the machines to send thousands of requests together onto a big server. That is known as a distributed denial of service attack. Because let's say, okay, my machine can only send 20 requests in a second, but if I have 10 machines like that, I can send 200 requests per second. If I have 1,000 machines like that, the attack will exponentially increase. So when you are trying to do a big attack where you are trying to, let's say, impact a server with a lot of many machines that have been compromised, that is known as a distributed denial of service attack. Okay. Then you have another type of network attack known as DNS attacks, domain name system attacks. How does a DNS attack work? So, okay, if now what does a DNS actually work to make sure that we can understand the attack aspect? I want to access facebook.com. Okay, my objective is to access facebook.com. I type in, okay, www.facebook.com. How the request works? I request for Facebook. Okay, the request will first go to the DNS, and the DNS will say, okay, you want to access facebook.com. You need to go to, let's say, 1.2.3.4 IP. That's where facebook.com is actually hosted. Then I will say, okay, that's the IP. I'll go to this IP to request for facebook.com. That's how DNS actually works. Now, in a DNS attack, the attacker will try to change the entry of facebook.com. The attacker will say, okay, let's change 1234 into 5.6.7.8. Now, even if I'm trying to access facebook.com, the DNS will say, okay, Facebook is now hosted under 5.6.7.8, not under 1.2.3.4. And this site is not the Facebook, it's the site that the attacker has created to compromise my ID and password. Okay, so that is what you mean by a domain name system attack. Then you have wireless attacks where, okay, if you are connecting to, let's say, a Wi-Fi connection which is open, somebody can listen to your traffic. You have wireless cards. Every machine, if you are connecting to a Wi-Fi, your machine has a wireless card. Attackers use specialized cards. So if you want to learn a bit about those cards, you can search for something known as alpha adapters. If you go on the Google and search for alpha adapters, now these are specialized wireless cards that can be used in your laptops, and these cards can help you capture whatever is going on in your Wi-Fi. So if let's say your phone is talking to Wi-Fi, another machine is connected to Wi-Fi, you can access all that information using these specialized cards. Then you have an on-path attacks. what does on path attack mean? That you are trying to modify the traffic in between. So what it is part of a man in the middle attack. So let's say, okay, there is a communication going between a user and a bank. So now you are trying to do an on path attack where, as an attacker, you are trying to listen to all the communication and you manipulate it in between. You change something and then you send the communication towards the bank. So let's say I want to send money to my friend. Somebody changes the account information and now the money goes to the attacker instead of my friend. So that's a on path attack. You are manipulating the information that's going on the path to your target server. Okay. The next one is credential replay. Now, credential replay is okay. Let's say in the same example, I have a user who is trying to log in into the bank. They are providing their username and password. What do I do as an attacker? I capture the ID and password. What will it do? It will say error, you have not logged in. What the user will do? They will try to do another login. Now, I have already captured the ID and password, which I could use at a later time to re authenticate and conduct fraudulent transactions. So that's how credential replay works. So you are capturing the credentials and then replaying it at some other point of time to carry out the attack. Okay. And the last one is injecting malicious code, which is okay, you take applications, you go to websites, and then you inject harmful code into the websites to make sure, okay, either they open a door for you or you are able to establish a communication channel with them. So anytime you write a malicious code into a software that is vulnerable, that software is led to a malicious code attack. Okay, so we have a question. In order to change it, they must have DNS server infected. Yes, so as part of the DNS attack, if they want, somebody needs to change the DNS entry, they need to have privileges to actually go to the DNS server and make that changes. So that is something that could be done by either of the vulnerabilities we talked about in the beginning. They could exploit a software vulnerability, they could exploit a network vulnerability of the DNS server to make sure they are able to change that entry. Rightly said. So we covered different types of network attacks. Are you guys following up on the differences between distributed denial of service? How does a DNS attack work? Changing the DNS entries, capturing wireless information, modifying data in between as part of the man in the middle attack. And then you have credential replay attack where you are capturing somebody's username and password and playing it at a later point of time. Okay. This is a very good case study that happened around an attack in 2018. It is known as the GitHub attack. Now, how does vulnerabilities actually compromise, let's say, big companies which we actually use or let's say access on a day-to-day basis? So if you look at this attack scenario, in February 2018, GitHub faced something known as a distributed denial of service attack. So it was the biggest attack ever recorded in the history of computers. Why it was the biggest attack? Because the traffic for the distributed denial of service attack reached the speed of 1.35 terabytes per second. So imagine the amount of data that was being sent to the GitHub servers. It was 1.35 TB per second. So even if we, let's say, today, if you have a workstation, if you receive, let's say 500 MB per second, or that's the download speed we have, right? 1 gigs per second, 2 gigs per second at most. That's the download speed we get. So imagine a server receiving 1.35 terabits per second, which led to the servers becoming totally unavailable. They were shut down, they crashed, and GitHub did not work for 10 minutes altogether. And if you see, 10 minutes all over the world GitHub stops working, it's a big loss to the company because everybody who is working in software development or trying to, let's say, do some IT things, software things, they use GitHub as part of their day-to-day operations. Okay, so it's a good case study to understand what they exploited in terms of what exactly was the vulnerability. This was the vulnerability memcached amplification. Okay, you can do a search to understand this vulnerability, but on an easier terms, what that vulnerability helped attackers do, they sent out small requests to the GitHub servers, and the servers process large queries based on those small requests. And when the small requests were going back and forth, the queries were being adding up, which led to the servers not functioning at all at some point. Okay, so the attack, as it's a distributed denial of service attack, one of the key components, it utilized thousands of autonomous systems. Why? Because you need a big army of attackers to actually send that much traffic. 1.35 TB per second is not a traffic that you could generate from one machine or two servers. You need an army of endpoints to actually conduct an attack. So that's why they use thousands of autonomous machines and tens of thousands of unique endpoints that actually work together to launch this scale of an attack. Okay. But thankfully, GitHub did have a good cybersecurity measures in place. Not the best, because if it would have been the best, they would have prevented the attack altogether. But they were able to fix the attack under, let's say, 10 minutes. So 10 minutes, the attack lasted. The things were down, things were not available. But after 10 minutes, they were able to bring back GitHub. Everything was up, running, and they were able to mitigate the attack. So how did they mitigate it? How did they fix it? Let's look at a couple of things, what they did to actually, let's say, capture the attack. So first, they had a DDoS protection platform, which is a web application firewall. They had a good platform in place that was actually absorbing the traffic. So whatever traffic was coming as part of 1.35 TB per second, the firewalls were absorbing it. So they were scaling up the firewalls that, okay, we'll absorb the traffic as many as it's coming along. Okay. So this was the firewall they have, Akamai Prolexic. That's the company that is providing this service to them. Okay, so that was absorbing of the traffic. Then once the traffic, they started absorbing the traffic, the next step was, let's try to start blocking it, right? We need to start filtering out the request to make sure that any request that is coming as an attack would not reach the server. Okay. So then they started doing filtering all the malicious traffic, all the IP addresses that were part of that DDoS attack or the distributed autonomous endpoints. They started filtering out those requests. They started blocking those requests from reaching the GitHub servers. Okay, so that was the second thing they did. They started filtering out the traffic. The third thing they did was they were able to identify the patterns of the attack that, okay, this request is coming from the attacker. Let's ignore it. Let's start dropping it so that our servers are still protected. So then they did an immediate response that actually helped them mitigate the whole attack. For sure, it was a financial impact. Even let's say for companies like these, a 1 minute downtime does introduce millions of dollars of loss. But let's say bringing the services back up in 10 minutes was also a considerable job. And they did improve on their DDoS capabilities to make sure an attack of this scale could be absorbed if it occurs again. Okay. So a very good case study to look at. Now we have a couple of exercise questions to address. Let's get together to answer those. Before that, we have a question: before server to accept 1.3 TB per second, won't it matter whether the internet carrier has that bandwidth? Today, if you talk about like 1.35 TB per second, it's not just based on one carrier. It's not just based on one ISP. So let's say, okay, you have 10 different providers of internet in your city. All those 10 providers would have bandwidth much more than 1.3 TB per second. So they use multiple providers to actually carry out this attack. So we'll try to do answer this exercise and then we'll go on a break. Okay. So let's try to answer these questions. The 2018 GitHub attack is considered a distributed amplification DDoS attack because it originated from many different. What would be the best match for this particular blank? So we do have a quiz thread. Make sure to answer as part of that. So that's right. It originated from many different autonomous endpoints or systems across the internet and exploited, misconfigured. What kind of vulnerability was identified? We talked about this in the beginning of the case study. So it's memcache. That was the vulnerability in the servers that they actually exploited to conduct large amount of traffic towards GitHub. Now, what did they do by sending a small spoofed? What did they send? Request. So they sent out a small spoofed request which generated a big output that actually started crashing out those servers. Perfect. That makes sense. So, a couple of key considerations. They had used a lot of autonomous endpoints. They exploited the memcached vulnerability and they sent out small requests as part of that 1.3 TB per second to generate big queries that led to all the systems being crashed. Okay, perfect. So let's take a break over here and we'll start again after the break. So, okay, welcome back, everybody. Let's go back to where we were. So we talked about different types of threats. We talked about different types of vulnerabilities, categories. We talked about a couple of different attacks from injection to replay to privilege escalation. We also discussed ransomwares, viruses, Trojan, worms, rootkits, and all of the types of malwares that exist, followed by different types of physical attacks that could actually translate to threats. Lastly, we covered the network attacks, talking about distributed denial of services, DNS hijacking, wireless attacks, on path attacks, credential replay, and malicious code. We looked at the case study from GitHub. Now we'll move on to the next part of attacks related to passwords. What are the issues related to passwords, or what kind of different attacks exist? So, at the most basic front, when we talk about passwords, we generally talk about two different types of attacks. One is known as a brute force attack, and the other is a password spraying attack. So the characteristics of both do, let's say, look similar, but definitely they achieve different objectives. So when we are trying to do a brute force attack, we are trying to, let's say, test as many different possible combinations of usernames and passwords to see, okay, if by any chance, if ID password actually gets accepted and we are given access onto that account. So that is a brute force attack. Now, what are the requirements of a brute force attack? You need to have a really good database. You need to have a really extensive list of username and passwords that you could use. And when we are saying extensive list, we are saying probably millions of usernames and password combinations you need to have, and you use a tool to actually start, let's say, doing a brute force on a login page to see if any of the username or password match. Okay. Now, another form is a password spraying attack where you're not trying all different combinations, but what you are doing is you are picking up different, let's say, passwords and trying against different accounts. So let's say you pick up one password. I pick up a password 12345 and I try against hundreds of accounts to see if any one account tries to accept it as a password. So that is a password spraying attack. So the objective of doing a password spraying attack instead of a brute force is, you may have seen that when you try to do login and you fail login 4 to 5 times, your account gets logged out, right? They say that, okay, you have to wait half an hour or you need to reset your password. Why? Because you have made these many incorrect attempts and now your account is logged out. So in order to move around this security control, we do password spraying. In that case, we are just trying to attempt one password but against thousands of accounts or hundreds of accounts. So that increases our probability that, okay, without getting accounts logged out, we can try one password against 1,000 accounts, then we try a second password against those thousands account again to make sure, or to try to find an account that would accept any one password that has been tried across. So that's the difference between a brute force and a password spraying attack. Now there is another attack known as a birthday attack. It is based on a mathematical problem. I won't go on this first. So birthday attack is based on a probability scenario. So in maths, where we have in mathematics, we have probabilities. So birthday attacks talk about a brute force attack where, okay, it says that how many combinations you actually need to try to make sure you get to a point that, okay, the password, even if you're trying to, let's say, input different passwords, but the hash value remains the same. Let's try to understand it. Okay, let me go here. Now, every time you try to authenticate with a username and password, you never send the password to authenticate. You always send the hash of the password. So let's say I have a password 12345. I want to authenticate with my username, which is admin. When my username and password is going for authentication, the password is always translated into a hash value. Now, the hash value of this could be, let's say, for an example, it could be 5678. Okay. Now, 5678 will actually travel across the network to authenticate me and say that, okay, I have a successful username and password login. Now, what the birthday attack says, that how many actually combinations you need to make so that you find a different random number altogether that will make the same hash value that the hash value of the original password is stored as. So let's say 1235 was the original password that got translated into a hash value of 5678. Now, how many combinations I should have so that I can find some other number. Let's say the other number could be 211894, that would produce the same hash value of 5678. So at the end, if I get the same hash value, I'm able to authenticate. I don't need the password, right? So that is what is the idea behind a birthday attack. So you need to identify. So let's to have it from the birthday example. Let's say in 1 year we have 365 days. Okay, every one day could count as somebody's birthday, right? Now, if I have 366 people in a room, there is 100% probability that two of them would have the same date of their birthday, right? Because 1 year has 365 days. So as soon as we have 366, 367 people in the room, two of them will definitely have a common date that would be their birthday. So that's what is the actual idea behind the problem, that, okay, how many combinations, how many people we need to put in a room, similarly how many passwords we need to have so that we are able to calculate a hash that will match the original hash of the password that's stored in the database. Okay, so that's the actual idea behind a birthday attack. Mostly we'll be talking about brute force and password spraying, but nowadays companies have implemented a lot of good security controls to prevent these attacks. As simple as your account gets logged out. As soon as you do 5 attempts, you are not allowed to access your account. You either need to reset your password or you need to wait for half an hour or 1 hour or let's say 24 hours before you can try again accessing your account. So that is how companies are implementing controls to make sure these kind of attacks do not succeed. Now, there are two other threats that exist. One is a downgrade attack, and the other is a collision attack. So, downgrade attack refers to when we are forcing a target system or we are forcing a website to follow less secure protocols to make sure we are able to carry out the attack. Let's take an example. Let's say I connect to a website. My connection always go over HTTPS. You always see this lock, right? There is a green lock on the top left of any website you access. So this lock actually tells that the connection is secure. Okay. Now, an attacker could forcefully say that, okay, I don't want to create a secure connection. I want to create an unsecure connection over HTTP. I don't want to use HTTPS. I just want to use HTTP. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to downgrade the connection requirements so that they start establishing a connection over unencrypted channel and we can intercept what's going on as part of that communication. So that is what is referred to as a downgrade attack. Then you have a collision attack. Now, collision attack is almost similar to what we talked about the birthday problem, that you find two different values that will produce the same hash for you, and that hash would be used to authenticate. So let's say, okay, my password is ABCD. That's my password. Okay. Now, with the hashing algorithm, my password translates into a hash value of 1234. Your password is probably completely different. It's, let's say, DEFG, but the hash value also produces the same hash of 1234. Now, ideally, I don't want to know your password. I only want to find a value that will create the same hash. And this same hash is known as a collision attack. Okay, so whenever we are trying to do a collision attack, we are trying to find another password that would create the same hash value instead of the regular one. Because at the end, the target where you are trying to authenticate, you are trying to, let's say, log in, is only understanding the hash value. They do not care that, okay, is this hash value coming from your password or from some other password? Okay. For them, the hash value is something they need to validate you on. So this is the idea behind a collision attack. Okay. Now, next we look at how does a website work. When you access a website, you are trying to access different parts of a site. How do those different parts work together and where do the security risk come into play? Okay. So when you talk about a website, this is how a website URL looks like, right? This is the first part, which is either HTTP or HTTPS. So if you see on the URL from which we have logged into Codio, it says it's HTTPS, which means it is a secure form of communication. This is a scheme that defines, is it secure or is it insecure? So let me show you how does we identify the security. So if you click on this lock icon, it says the connection is secure. And if you click on the security, it says, okay, the site has a valid certificate issued by a trusted authority. What does that mean? That means that any information we put into this site, our passwords, our credit card information, or whatever, it will be sent securely. So nobody can actually do eavesdropping or try to, let's say, intercept the communication. Okay. So that is what we identify as part of the scheme. But on the other side, if it is just HTTP, what you see in the example, it means that the connection is unencrypted, it's insecure, so anybody can listen to the traffic and they can try to identify what you are actually doing with the target website. The second part is the domain name. what you are trying to access, what site it is. So wikipedia.org is the domain name of the site we are trying to access, which is the second part of your URL. Then you have the third part known as index.php, which is the actual file. So let's say in my case, if you look at the example for the URL and under which we are presenting this lecture, codio.com is actually the domain name over here, and vulnerabilities and attack methods is the actual, let's say, file path we have reached. So that's a page under Codio which we are trying to access. Okay, so that is specified under your file path. Then you have certain parameters that define, okay, if I'm going for something specific. So let me give you an example of the parameters where you see my initials M Nagpal. That's the parameter Codio is trying to use to display a content on behalf of the teacher, not a student. So that's where you differentiate. Okay. And that's what you specify with the help of a parameter. Then you have anchor. Anchor is the tab. So let's say if I scroll down, if I move to another part of the page, on the same page, if I scroll down, I move to a different anchor. So if I'm, let's say, going through a website, I'm trying to click on different links. When I'm scrolling down, I'm clicking on different anchors, which are the breaks in the page. So that's how a website is actually, let's say, translated into a URL. So you have a scheme talking about if it's HTTP or HTTPS. Then you have a domain name that talks what exactly is the site you are trying to access. Then you have the file path, which translates to which page on that site you want to access. So if you're logging into your banking site, you go to account summary, you go to your credit card page, you go to your transaction page. So these are the different pages that exist as part of your banking site. Then you have parameters. Parameters specify that, okay, it's the page for your account. So if I log in from my account, the parameter will say that, okay, this account summary page needs to be for this particular individual. This credit card page needs to be for that individual. That is something you identify under parameters. And then let's say, okay, I'm talking about a big page where I have transactions, credit card summary, savings account, and all different types of account. So when I scroll that page, I get to, let's say, savings account statement. So my anchor will change to saving account. So that's how a web URL actually looks like. Does it make sense? Following the different parts of the URL? Because all the SQL injection attacks, all the other types of web application attacks actually exploit these parameters, these values to gain access to something on the backend which we are not allowed to see. Okay, so it's important to understand what these different parts of a URL look like. So we have a question, what is the difference between a birthday attack and a collision attack? A very good question, I would say, because they both look similar. Birthday attack is using the concept of collision attack, but it is only variating in terms of the probability. Collision attack says, okay, we have two different passwords that would create the same hash. Birthday attack says, yes, we need to have two different passwords that would create the same hash, but how do we find those two different passwords? Via identifying, let's say, 100 or 200 people that would have the, let's say, same birthdays on a single date. So that's an application of a collision attack. That's how we can say it. Okay. Now, next, we look at something known as threat intelligence, one of the most interesting topics as a security analyst you would be coming across. What is threat intelligence? Now, we talked about firewalls, we talked about security controls, we talked about a lot of things you could actually implement to make sure your security tools are intelligent. How does your firewall know what I need to block? How does your, let's say, antivirus know that this file is a virus, this file is a Trojan? There needs to be some intelligence that needs to be feed onto those tools that will make them understand that, okay, this is malware I need to block. This is an attack I need to block. So all that different types of information, when it is coming from the sources, is known as a threat intelligence feed. Okay. Now, threat intelligence, there are companies in the world that provide certain types of threat intelligence. Let's take a couple of examples, probably that would give a good visibility. Now, let's talk about App Any Run. Now, this is a very good threat intelligence tool that could be used. So if I go on the website and I go to the reports, now see all this information that, okay, this is a virus under Windows 10. This is the hash value. All this is threat intelligence that, okay, somebody uploaded this information on this site and said, okay, if you find something like this, block it because it's a virus or it's a Trojan. So it's really important that you actually identify good threat intelligence feeds that would actually help you identify the latest attacks that are going in the world. So App Anywhere is one. Yes, we talked about CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is one of the best platform that gives very good threat intelligence feeds. Okay, so if you see over here, if I talk about, okay, there is an analysis of this file. Let's open that. Now, if you see on the top right, it says it's a malicious activity. Okay, it's a malicious activity related to phishing. Now, this is the threat intelligence feed we know that, or we need in our security tools that, okay, if you find something like this URL media.blueberry.com, it's a malware, it's a phishing activity. So this is the threat intelligence I need my email security tools to understand. Okay. And the more, let's say, threat intelligence you will have in your security tools, the more efficient they would be, the more productive they would be. So you need to make sure that you're getting really good threat intelligence in order to identify any malicious behaviors. So if you go back, you can find as many that's what they call under their threat intelligence aspect. So you can get a lot of threat intelligence feeds, you can get threat intelligence reports that will give you the latest update on all the threats that are going around in the world. Okay. So it's really important that we have good threat intelligence coming into our infrastructure, into our security tools to make sure that they are intelligent enough to identify all the attacks that are going around in the world. If you want to search for more, you can always go and do a quick Google search. If you do, okay, a Google search on threat intelligence, you will find different tools that are giving threat intelligence feeds. One of the another one I would like to share is Cisco Talos. That's also a very good threat intelligence tool. We know that Cisco is the backbone of networks across the world, right? This is a very big company. It has firewalls, it has switches, it has routers, everything that the network is composed of. They have, this is known as their threat intelligence portal, where you can actually go and see the reputation of IP, see if something is blacklisted or not. So if I go on their trends, see, this is all threat intelligence information coming from Cisco that, okay, this is an IP address that is used to send, let's say, phishing emails or not. So if you see, they give the reputation as well. If it's a good IP address, if it's a bad IP address, if it's a malicious IP address or not, to make sure that your firewalls are up to date with the attacks going around in the world. Okay. And there are a lot of different threat intelligence companies available. CrowdStrike is one of the best threat intelligence companies because they have good antivirus tools, they have good security monitoring tools, so they have their own threat intelligence. So it's really interesting to look onto these things because it will give you an idea, okay, where the attacks are maximum originating from. So if I, let's say if you go, there is a red kind of a thing. There is a red mark. I'm not sure if I can access it or not, but you get an idea. Okay, this is the IP address as part of my intelligence. This is the URL behind that IP address. And what is the reputation? Is it good? Is it bad? Do I need to block it or not? So you get all of that information as part of your threat intelligence activity. Okay. Okay. So let's go back. So anytime we have, let's say we have a good security team, we have a lot of security tools in our company, those tools would not work well if we do not have good threat intelligence capabilities integrated onto them. So that's another subscription we need to have as part of a security team, that, okay, bring us the best threat intelligence of the world, and then you would be able to identify attacks much more proactively than from a company that doesn't have good threat intelligence. Okay, so does the concept of threat intelligence make sense? Yes. Now let's see what are the different things that make up the threat intelligence. What are the things we need to include? Okay, so we'll talk about that. Before that, we'll quickly touch on the different type of threat actors, because I think you have covered that as part of previous modules as well. So we'll do a quick look. So we have cyber criminals that actually attack infrastructures for financial gains. Their whole objective is to actually get some money out of the attack. Then you have nation state actors, big cyber terror groups that are actually working on behalf of the governments. They are actually funded and they are trying to carry out large scale attacks. So a couple of example of nation state actors: Cozy Beer, Fancy Beer. If you search for these APT groups, they belong to China and they belong to Russia, and they are big groups working under the government agencies that are actually creating big attacks all across the globe. Okay, then you have hacktivists, people who like to, let's say, promote their ideology. Okay, somebody nowadays you may have seen, there was a lot of campaign against, animal abuse in terms of turning vegan. So if you want to propagate those campaigns and you try to, let's say, compromise websites of the world and try to promote your information, that is something you do as part of an hacktivist activity. Then you have script kiddies, somebody like you and me who probably do not have a lot of hacking knowledge, but we try to copy the hacking code from the internet and try to just run it on a machine to see if we are able to hack it or not. So that is something known as a script kiddie. Then you have the last one known as insider threats. So insider threats, anyone within the company, working within the company who may end up, let's say, doing a data breach, giving up the information, leaking the company's confidential information, or sell that information to a group to make some money. So from anyone from within the company who is doing, let's say, a malicious activity is referred to as a insider threat. Okay, now let's go and check. We talked about indicators of compromise. We're talking about threat intelligence. Let's see how does this threat intelligence actually build up. Okay, and this is where we talk about the threat pyramid of pain. So if you see, the threat pyramid of pain has roughly 6 levels, starting off from hash values to IP addresses to domain names to network artifacts to tools to techniques, tactics, and procedures. Now, let's take a step back and let's try to see how do we actually analyze these pyramid of pain? How do we understand these different aspects we are looking on the screen? So these are the different indicators of compromise. Hash values could become an indicator of compromise. Okay, if there is a file that has a malicious hash value, we'll block it. That's an indicator. We know that it is a file that would compromise our infrastructure. We'll try to block it. We may have IP addresses that are, let's say, trying to do a hacking activity from some part of the world. We'll try to block those IP addresses. Then we have domain names, URLs. Okay, we know there is a XYZ URL which belongs to a hacker somewhere located in another part of the world. we can block the domain names. Then you have network and host artifacts, which is okay, anything that is a combination of domain names, IP addresses, and hash values. The biggest example for network and host artifacts is when somebody receives a phishing email. So, a phishing email is coming from an IP address. You have an IP address behind the email. So, you have an IOC that, okay, this IP address is used to send phishing emails. You have a domain name as well. Why? Because when you have a phishing link inside that email, it leads you to a website, a domain. So, you get a domain as well as part of that phishing email. Then, if there is an attachment coming as part of a phishing email, a PDF or any other file that is said to be malicious, you will have a hash value as well. So, when you are trying to correlate information from multiple IOCs, then it comes under the category of network and host artifacts. Okay. Then you have, let's say, indicators of compromise coming from the different tools, firewalls, IPS, IDS, a lot of security tools you implement. They are also generating IOCs for you. So you are analyzing all of this information, hashes, IP addresses, domains, artifacts in a tool. So your threat intelligence improves, right? Let's say, okay, if you just know hashes or if you just know IP addresses, you won't be able to identify the threat up to the extent if you are able to relate all that information together in a tool. So that is where the tool takes the number two spot, and the first spot is taken by something known as tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now, this is a terminology coming from a framework. We'll be talking about that framework in the upcoming classes. But tactics, techniques, and procedures actually refer to the combination of all the different artifacts you are seeing below this: hash values, IP addresses, domain names, a combination of all of these things that would work together to identify a threat or an attack. Okay, so that's how the pyramid of pain looks like. Now, another important aspect to look at is these values, where you see trivial, easy, simple, annoying, challenging, and tough. Now, this represents, let's say, okay, you have security to block hash values. Okay, let's say you're working as a security analyst in a company and you have the capability that you can block any malicious hashes, any hashes that belong to an attacker. The attacker can easily change a hash and try to attack your infrastructure again. It's very easy to generate a new hash. Let's say they have a file which is having a virus. They just add a comma into that file. The hash value will completely change and they can carry out an attack. So the things you see on this part of the screen, trivial, easy, are also denoting how difficult it is for the attacker now to attack that infrastructure. So if we are just blocking the hash values, it is very easy. It's very trivial. They could change the hashes and come up with a new attack. Okay. Now, if we are trying to just block the IP addresses along with the hashes, it becomes a bit complicated, but still they can change the IP, they can spoof the IP, they can impersonate, they can actually, let's say, try to manipulate their own IP and come up with a different IP address, and they could still conduct their attack. Okay. Then let's say if we are trying to block domains as well, we are trying to block the URLs that, okay, any URLs coming from this country is completely blocked. So that is a big barrier we are putting in front of the attacker, that, okay, even if you change IPs within your country, you are still blocked. So it gets difficult for them to carry out the attack. But still, they can change their IPs, route the IP or route the traffic through a VPN, they can take different routes and they can still try to conduct an attack. The complication for an attacker starts when they are at network and host artifacts. So when I talked about that, okay, you have a phishing email, you have all the things you can analyze. You can analyze the domain, you can analyze the link, you can analyze the hash, you can analyze all these artifacts together and then see where the attack is coming from. At that point, if you have that kind of a security, you have indicators of compromise at this level which you can detect and analyze, it becomes really difficult for an attacker to conduct an attack. That's why it becomes annoying for an attacker that, okay, now they have to make sure that they don't use the IP addresses, which are attacking IP addresses. They do not use the hashes. They do not use the domain. So they change everything. Okay. Then, if you have good tools, like, okay, you have a SIM tool in place, you have an intrusion prevention in place, you have firewalls in place, that makes them challenging to conduct an attack, because now they know that you have a lot of security controls in place. You have a lot of IOCs that are working together in those tools to actually detect any attack patterns. And lastly, if you understand now, as part of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, what is the idea behind tactics, techniques, and procedures? We try to analyze what are the ways attackers could come into. We try to simulate their activity that, okay, that's an entry point for an attacker. We need to probably start putting controls over there. Then we start identifying, okay, that's another door they could come into. We'll start putting out security controls over there. So if we are trying to use indicators of compromise up to the level of these tactics, techniques, and procedures, and we are trying to understand every aspect, or let's say every activity of an attacker, we will make it really tough for them to actually compromise the infrastructure. So that's how these values also change based on the indicators of compromise you are able to analyze. So it's really important as part of a good organization practice that you have tools, you have people in security that can work with all of these indicators of compromise, that know how to understand hashes, that know how to understand IP addresses, they know how to block and unblock URLs. They are able to, let's say, investigate phishing emails. They are able to do artifact analysis. They have access to tools. That is why you would see a lot of times when you have entry level security jobs, they ask you for experience on antiviruses, SIM tools, they ask you for experiences on intrusion prevention, firewalls, because they expect you to understand that, okay, you know how to interpret IOCs, you know how to block IP addresses, you know how to make sure that, okay, you are protecting the infrastructure altogether. So because at that point you are making really challenging for an attacker to break into your infrastructure. And then let's say, okay, you have a good security in your organization, then you start working towards tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now you will say, okay, I have all the tools I need. Now let's start thinking like an attacker and see what they could do, how they could come into our infrastructure. And then step by step, you start identifying all the doors, all the entry points of the attacker, and then start to seal them by putting up security controls, by blocking up things. So at that point, it becomes really tough for any attacker to compromise your infrastructure. Okay, does that make sense? Does the pyramid of pain helps understand the different types of indicators of compromise, from hash values to tactics, techniques, and procedures? Okay, perfect. So that brings up towards the conclusion for today's course. So we'll try to wrap up with what we have covered so far. Okay, so we talked a bit about vulnerabilities, the different categories, starting off from hardware, software, network, and let's say physical vulnerabilities, human-related vulnerabilities. We talked about different kinds of threats. We talked about malwares, a very interesting topic, ransomwares, viruses, trojans. How do they work together and how do they actually differ from each other? Very important to understand, because when you start looking out for, let's say, job interviews, or you start looking out to go for security analyst jobs, these are the questions that would be asked. How do you differ between a Trojan and a worm? How does a virus differ from a worm? What is the most, let's say, biggest threat that organizations actually face? So ransomware is the one. Okay, then we talked about physical attacks, talking about RFID cloning. We talked about some environmental attacks, manipulating the HVAC. As simple as that. You don't need a lot of technical skills. You don't need to be a hacker to actually create a havoc, or let's say create a mess in the infrastructure. If you have access to the infrastructure and I'm able to turn the temperature to full heat of the server room, I have attacked the server room because now the servers are not available anymore. Okay. Then we talked about a couple of network attacks, starting off with, let's say, man in the middle attack, on path attack, wireless hacking attack, wireless intercepting of the traffic attack. So we talked about how network can be abused to conduct different types of attacks. Okay. Then we looked at the case study from GitHub, how GitHub got compromised for 10 minutes. And even after having a lot of security controls, they were still not available for 10 minutes where their services were down. And what was the objective behind the attack? Followed that, we looked at password problems. We talked about birthday attack. We talked about collision. We talked about password spraying. We talked about brute force attack and how they differ from each other. Then we had a slide. We talked about a couple of different other threats as well, followed by website URL understanding. How do you analyze the scheme, the domain name, the parameters? How does a website URL actually looks like? So the next time you access a site, try to identify, okay, that's the scheme, that's the domain name, that's the parameter, that's the anchor. Whenever you log in into a banking site, or let's say your any site that requires your account, make sure you start identifying these different fields, because the more you understand them, the more you would be able to capture that, okay, if there is a SQL injection attack, that's the field that gets changed. Okay. So it would be a good exercise. Then we talked about threat intelligence, something that actually makes all your security tools up to date with the latest threats going around in the world. This is a very interesting topic. You could always take time whenever you are free, take the time to explore different threat intelligence feeds, look at where the attacks are coming from in the world, look at, okay, which country or which group is actually putting out the most number of attacks, and then try to identify the IOCs, indicators of compromise. Okay, these are the hash values of this attack. These are, the IP addresses related onto this attack. These are the, let's say, the URLs which the attackers are talking with as part of this attack. So that will help you understand that if you want to go and protect your organization, you need to block these IPs, you need to block these URLs, you need to block these hash values to actually make sure that attack cannot be conducted in your organization. Okay. And lastly, we closed up with looking at the threat pyramid of pain, that at one side gives you what are the different IOCs you actually need to start analyzing to make sure you have a good secure environment. And at the same time, with every layer of IOC, you understand you are trying to, let's say, implement in your infrastructure, how difficult you make for an attacker to actually conduct a big scale attack. So that's it for today. Let's move on to the knowledge check and see, were we able to follow on with the content of the lesson? So let's start with question number one. You are a cybersecurity analyst investigating a data breach at a major bank's online portal. During your investigation, you discover that the attackers gain unauthorized access to the bank's database. So make sure you understand these terms. They are trying to access the database by exploiting a vulnerability in the website's login. Okay. Now they manipulated the login fields to execute malicious commands and extract sensitive data from the bank's database. What kind of attack you think it is? So let's start hearing out the guesses. Okay, so we do see a couple of guesses going for A. That is right. It is an example of a injection attack. Somebody did ask about SQL injection as well, I think, in the live chat, and that's exactly the use case behind a SQL injection attack, where we are trying to break into the database which is storing all the information related towards the bank accounts. Good answer. Question number two, you download a free photo editing app from an unknown website. Later, strange programs start running on your computer and your bank account starts to show unauthorized transactions. What kind of malware was actually implemented? Go back towards the differences between Trojan, virus, and worm. So anything that is coming as an attachment with a legitimate application. So you are downloading a photo editing app, but it is bringing a malware along with it. So it is likely a Trojan. Perfect. Question number three. A security guard notices someone entering a restricted lab using what looks like a valid key card. Later, it discovered that the original card was never lost but had been scanned briefly in the crowd elevator. What physical attack most likely occurred? So, somebody tried to scan somebody's card in the elevator, and now they are trying to use that card to get inside. So, yes, this is a typical example of RFID cloning. Another very good example of RFID cloning is when you use your credit cards to tap, right? Most of us use credit cards. We have it in our Apple Pay or Google Pay, and we try to just tap it on the NFC to make sure we are able to pay. People are, let's say, attackers are actually moving around you just with those scanners, and they could just place a scanner near your wallet and it would, let's say, initiate a tap if let's say you are in a mode to conduct a payment. So that's how critical these things get. Okay, so RFID cloning is the right answer. Uh, the first question is right, but I don't know, it's not working over here. But yeah, injection attack is the right answer. And yes, it's not a good idea to always have RFID wallets because anyone could clone the capabilities of that RFID. So very good comment on the chat. Next question, you are using a Wi-Fi at a cafe to check your work email. Unbeknownst to you, an attacker is silently capturing and modifying the data. So they are capturing the data and they are modifying the data between your laptop and the mail server. What kind of attack it is? Make sure you understand the difference that, okay, between the attack you specify. Okay, I do see a lot of B's. So yes, exactly right. Do not confuse it with wireless jamming or wireless attacks because we are modifying the data in transit. Okay, so that is an on-path attack. Moving on to question number five. A hacker group launches an attack against a corporation to protest its environmental policy. So there's a group of attackers, they want to protest against the environmental policies of a company, and they are trying to post messages, political messages explaining that the attack was meant to raise awareness. So what category of attackers it is? Yes, it is for promoting an ideology, so they are referred to as hacktivist. Perfect. That wraps up the course content from Codio. So we'll take the time for the Kahoot now. Let me run that up.